To truly grasp the wisdom of Lucius Annaeus Seneca, we must look beyond the scrolls and the gilded halls of Rome. We must find the man beneath the philosopher and the statesman, a figure perpetually caught between the profound promise of Stoic serenity and the terrifying, relentless reality of a world governed by unpredictable, absolute power. His was a life lived on a knife's edge, where a single speech or a simple misunderstanding could transition instantly from glory to a death sentence. Seneca was born around 4 BCE in Cordoba, a city in Roman Hispania, modern Spain, a wealthy and refined province, but still far from the political epicenter. This external position, this sense of being slightly removed, perhaps gave him an outsider's clarity, a perspective vital for a philosopher destined to analyze Rome's madness from within. He inherited a great gift from his father, Seneca the Elder, a mastery of eloquence and rhetoric. His family belonged to the wealthy class that prioritized education and public service, but the world of words, the power of persuasion, would soon prove to be a dangerous, double-edged sword under the emperors. While still a child, he was brought to the glittering, tumultuous city of Rome to receive the most elite education. He excelled in language and law, preparing for the political path laid out for him. Yet a crucial, persistent struggle defined his youth: chronic, debilitating illness. Seneca's body was frail. He was plagued by severe respiratory issues, likely tuberculosis, that forced him into frequent, protracted periods of retreat. For most men, this physical weakness would have been a professional handicap. For Seneca, it was a philosophical catalyst. Confined and forced into contemplation, he realized early that while the body could be utterly unreliable, the mind, the inner life, was a fortress that could be built up and strengthened, immune to the decay of the flesh. It was in this context of physical vulnerability that he encountered Stoicism. This philosophy, which had traveled from ancient Athens to Rome, offered a perfect antidote to both his personal suffering and the external chaos of the empire. The core teaching of Stoicism was simple and radical. True happiness, eudaimonia, comes only from virtue and reason. Everything else, health, wealth, public praise, even life itself, was categorized as indifferent. These external forces could neither guarantee a good life nor destroy one, provided the mind remained disciplined and sound. His teachers, like Attalus and Socion, guided him into the practical rigor of the philosophy, encouraging simple habits, intellectual discipline, and the pursuit of inner calm, a state known as apatheia, not a lack of feeling, but a freedom from being enslaved by chaotic passions. Seneca's health crisis reached a peak around 26 CE, necessitating a long period of quiet recovery. He traveled to Egypt, a place of ancient wisdom and comparative calm, where his relative, the Roman prefect, provided him sanctuary. For nearly a decade, he steeped himself in Hellenistic culture and scientific study, refining the philosophical armor he would need for his return to Rome. When he finally returned to the capital, he was a man of profound learning and dazzling rhetorical skill, ready to enter the cutthroat world of the Senate. He was almost immediately successful, his brilliance as an orator capturing the imagination of the public and the respect of his peers. But in imperial Rome, a popular voice was a dangerous thing. His eloquence drew the immediate, terrifying jealousy of the Emperor Caligula, a ruler known for his escalating paranoia and sudden arbitrary cruelty. Caligula reportedly watched Seneca speak and became convinced that such a persuasive man was a direct threat to his own absolute power. He issued an order for Seneca's execution. Seneca's life was saved, not by philosophy, but by a chilling piece of pragmatic advice. A powerful woman at court assured Caligula that the sickly orator was so frail that he would soon die on his own, making the political risk of execution unnecessary. This early, visceral encounter with death, spared only by the frailty he had sought to overcome, was the ultimate brutal initiation into the practice of Stoicism. He learned that the absolute power of the emperor was the ultimate example of the external indifferent, a sudden, unavoidable catastrophe that could only be met with internal preparation and mental fortitude. Despite this terror, Seneca pushed on, successfully forging a career, marrying his devoted wife Paulina, and critically mastering the financial levers of the Roman world, eventually accumulating one of the largest fortunes in the empire. This wealth, a tangible measure of his engagement with the material world, would become a source of immense philosophical contradiction that he would spend the rest of his life analyzing. Can a man be truly self-sufficient and virtuous while possessing the kind of wealth that makes one a target? The foundations of his life were now set: the philosophical commitment to inner peace, the ambition that drove him to the center of power, the physical weakness that forced contemplation, and the early, terrifying realization that life in Rome was a game played against inevitable, sudden catastrophe. The first great catastrophe was about to strike, forcing the privileged orator from the Senate to the desolation of exile, where his philosophy would be refined not in the classroom, but in the painful test of isolation. The life of Seneca, the brilliant orator and ascending politician, was shattered by the arbitrary caprice of the emperor. The near-fatal jealousy of Caligula was followed by the calculated cruelty of his successor, Claudius, a man less prone to madness, but equally steeped in the toxic paranoia of absolute power. Seneca's philosophical armor, painstakingly forged during his years of illness, was about to undergo its first true test against the relentless forces of fate. The crisis struck in 41 CE. A new empress, Messalina, the ambitious and notoriously ruthless wife of Claudius, sought to consolidate her power. Seneca, whose intellectual prowess and public popularity were already immense, represented a political threat to her faction. A convenient pretense was found. Seneca was accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, the emperor's niece. The charge was almost certainly a fabricated piece of political maneuvering. Yet under the system of the Principate, where the emperor's word was instant, uncontestable law, the truth was meaningless. Seneca was condemned without a real trial. He was not executed, a testament to his residual political protection, but he was stripped of his wealth, his property, and his place in the Senate, and condemned to exile on the desolate island of Corsica. This banishment was more than a mere inconvenience. It was a profound social and intellectual death sentence. Corsica, rough and isolated, was a barren rock compared to the intellectual ferment of Rome. The sentence removed him not only from political power and the comforts of his immense wealth, but most painfully for a man of letters, from the libraries, the debates, and the philosophical community that sustained his mind. He spent 8 long years in this desolate confinement. For a philosopher who taught that external events were indifferent, This was the ultimate agonizing test case. How does one maintain inner peace when stripped of all personal choice, status, and intellectual nourishment? Philosophy under duress, the consolation dialogues. The genius of Seneca was that he did not succumb to despair. Instead, he forced his philosophical principles from the abstract realm into practical, written form. Exile became his unexpected literary laboratory, refining his ideas on how the mind could conquer misfortune. During these years, he composed some of his most profound philosophical works, known as the Consolation Dialogues. These were not abstract treatises, but deeply personal, immediate arguments designed to bring peace to those suffering deep loss. Consolation to Helvia, his mother. This was a powerful attempt to soothe his own mother, who was suffering intensely from the loss of her son, believing his career and life were ruined. Seneca argued that her grief was a product of unreasoned expectations, not a necessary consequence of his exile. He insisted that while his physical location had changed, his true self, his mind, his capacity for virtue, and his dedication to study remained entirely free and untouchable by the emperor's decree. Consolation to Polybius, the emperor's freedman. This dialogue represented a more politically calculated work. Polybius was a powerful, influential freedman in Claudius's court who had recently lost his brother. While Seneca offered genuine comfort, the work was also intended to subtly remind Polybius, and through him the emperor, of Seneca's existence, his intellectual vigor, and his fitness to return to Rome. Though criticized for its excessive flattery, it demonstrated Seneca's pragmatic understanding of how power operates. The inner work of resilience. These 8 years in Corsica were a forced, deep dive into the Stoic practice of acceptance. Seneca wrote extensively about the concept of premeditation of evils, premeditatio malorum, the discipline of constantly imagining and preparing for the worst-case scenario. He argued that fate already owns all that we possess, our wealth, our status, and even our life. The wise man, therefore, holds these things lightly, recognizing they are merely on loan. When misfortune strikes, when exile comes, the wise man is not surprised, for he has already intellectually conceded their loss. This period of forced solitude provided him with the unshakable conviction that a man's true domain is his inner response to events. The world can confiscate the outer life, but the inner life, the inner citadel, remains inviolable. This insight would become the bedrock of his most influential later teachings. The summons and the emperor's new family. In 49 CE, a monumental political shift in Rome unexpectedly freed Seneca. Empress Messalina had fallen from power and been executed. The new, infinitely more influential empress was Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's niece, and a woman of ruthless ambition and extraordinary foresight. Agrippina had one overriding objective: to secure the succession for her young son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the future Emperor Nero. She needed a brilliant, internationally respected, and highly disciplined mind to guide the boy's education, someone who owed his entire existence to her favor. Seneca, the renowned philosopher and political victim, was the perfect candidate. His exile was revoked. His return to Rome was a dizzying reversal of fortune. He went from the utter desolation of a condemned man to the inner circle of imperial power. He was not only restored to the Senate, but was immediately appointed praetor, a high judicial office, and most importantly, tutor to the 12-year-old Nero. This appointment thrust Seneca into the single most challenging and dangerous role a Stoic philosopher could undertake, attempting to instill virtue and self-control into the air of absolute power. The dangerous new project, guiding Nero. Seneca now faced the fundamental conflict of his life. Can power be tamed by philosophy? Nero was a boy of immense volatile appetites, possessing a talent for the arts, but a dangerous lack of discipline. Seneca's mission, orchestrated by Agrippina, was to mold Nero into the ideal ruler, a benevolent, philosophical prince who would rule with restraint and reason, a Stoic king. Seneca began his mentorship with intense dedication, tutoring the boy in rhetoric, history, and philosophy, attempting to channel his vast potential away from cruelty and toward statesmanship. This return to Rome also saw the beginning of Seneca's immense financial accumulation. Through imperial grants, legacies, and his continued participation in Roman finance, his wealth grew exponentially. He successfully rationalized this apparent contradiction, arguing that wealth itself was amoral, neither good nor bad. It was merely a preferred indifferent. It could be used for generous acts, supporting friends and philosophers, and providing a powerful platform, as long as one remained internally prepared to lose it all. For 5 years, Seneca meticulously guided his protege. When Claudius died in 54 CE, a death widely suspected to have been orchestrated by Agrippina, Nero, barely 17, ascended to the throne. Seneca was now at the zenith of his power. He was not just the tutor, but the principal advisor and speechwriter to the new emperor. Alongside the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Sextus Afranius Burrus, Seneca formed an essential partnership that would govern the Roman world. The early years of Nero's reign, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years, are often attributed to the wise counsel of Seneca and Burrus. It was a period of relatively restrained governance, sound financial policy, and philosophical moderation, a brief, shining moment where it seemed possible that a philosopher could indeed temper absolute power. But absolute power rarely tolerates restraint for long. Nero's inherent vanity and volatility were already straining the philosophical leash, and the political partnership that kept him in check was dangerously fragile. Seneca was about to learn that when philosophy confronts madness, philosophy seldom wins. The stage was set for a descent into darkness, where Seneca would have to choose between the life he had rebuilt and the principles he had taught. The 5 good years, power, compromise, and the shadow of the throne. The return from exile was complete, and Seneca now stood at the pinnacle of influence, not as a king, but as the unseen hand guiding the young Emperor Nero. This period, beginning with Nero's ascension in 54 CE, marks the central, most complex contradiction of Seneca's life. The philosopher, who taught the necessity of inner withdrawal, was now utterly and practically immersed in the brutal calculus of imperial power. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, celebrated as the Quinquennium Neronis, Seneca and his trusted partner, Sextus Afranius Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, governed the vast Roman world. This was an era of unprecedented restraint and good governance, a testament to the brief and shining success of a philosophical mentorship. Philosophical governance. Seneca carefully guided Nero's public image and policy. The administration introduced financial reforms, reduced corruption, and displayed unusual clemency, the very virtue Seneca valued most in a ruler. When Nero delivered his first speech to the Senate, written entirely by Seneca, it promised an end to the secretive, toxic politics of the previous reign. The platform of clemency. During this time, Seneca wrote one of his most politically vital works, De Clementia, on clemency. This essay was an explicit, urgent appeal directed to the young emperor, arguing that mercy, not cruelty, is the most powerful and secure foundation for absolute rule. Seneca used Stoic reasoning to show that cruelty breeds fear and rebellion, while clemency secures the love and loyalty of the people, making the ruler safer. It was, in effect, a philosophical firewall intended to restrain Nero's inherent savagery. The Golden Pen, philosophical production at the zenith. The security and platform afforded by his political position allowed Seneca to produce his most powerful and famous philosophical writings, works that defined Roman Stoicism for history. He wrote with the explicit goal of creating practical guidance for managing the human condition, using a sharp, epigrammatic style perfect for urgent contemplation. De Ira, on anger. This was a profound, detailed analysis of the most destructive human passion. Seneca argued that anger is a temporary form of madness, a chaotic eruption of the mind that immediately destroys reason and virtue. Drawing upon medical and philosophical analogies, he showed that anger is never helpful, even in correcting wrongdoing, and must be suppressed immediately before it escalates. The mind must be kept in a perpetual state of calm readiness. De tranquilitate animi, on the tranquility of the mind. Written as advice to his friend Serenus, this work addresses the dilemma of restlessness, the inability to find peace, even amidst good fortune. Seneca advised finding a balanced life that blends public duty with private reflection. Crucially, he advised against the philosophical pursuit of impractical, excessive ideals, encouraging instead a pragmatic engagement with the world while maintaining internal detachment. De Vita Beata, on the happy life. Here, Seneca directly tackled the contradiction of his own wealth, arguing that the pursuit of the happy life is the pursuit of virtue, which aligns the will with nature. He insisted that wealth itself is neutral. It is the love of wealth and the dependence upon it that corrupts the soul. He positioned himself as a traveler who possesses abundant provisions, but is ready to abandon them instantly if the journey demands it. The inevitable rupture, Nero's descent. The philosophical leash around Nero began to chafe quickly. The emperor, possessed of a tremendous ego and a craving for public adulation, found the restraints imposed by his mother, Agrippina, and the serious counsel of Seneca and Burrus increasingly intolerable. The deterioration was gradual, but inexorable. Nero's interest turned from statecraft to the arts, theater, and chariot racing, activities considered frivolous, even scandalous for a Roman emperor. His personal excesses grew, consuming his time and resources. The political struggle at court centered on control. Agrippina, the mastermind who put Nero on the throne, desperately tried to maintain her power over her son. Seneca and Burrus, sensing the danger of Agrippina's obsessive control, found themselves forced into a dark alliance with Nero to neutralize his overbearing mother. The moral abyss, the murder of Agrippina. The absolute break came in 59 CE with the horrifying murder of Agrippina. Nero, no longer content to be restrained, decided his own mother was the greatest obstacle to his freedom and increasingly depraved impulses. Nero's first attempt to kill her was shocking in its brazenness. He designed a collapsible boat to drown her during a sea voyage. When Agrippina survived the shipwreck and swam to shore, Nero was forced to resort to direct, open murder, sending Praetorian soldiers to execute her in her villa. This act was the point of no return for Nero's reign and Seneca's moral life. Seneca and Burrus were intimately aware of the plot. When Nero's agents returned, shaken by the brutality of their task, Nero turned to his advisors, demanding a public justification for the matricide. Seneca faced the ultimate, impossible choice. Option A, virtue and suicide. Condemn the murder, uphold Stoic virtue, and immediately face execution by the paranoid emperor, thereby losing his platform entirely. Option B, pragmatic compromise. Write a speech justifying the murder, maintaining his influence over Nero, and hoping to temper the emperor's actions in the future. Seneca chose compromise. He wrote the official letter to the Senate, justifying Agrippina's murder by portraying her as a treacherous, power-hungry conspirator who had deserved her fate. This moment is the dark shadow over Seneca's philosophical reputation. To many critics, he had sold his soul, abandoning the pure principles of Stoicism for the preservation of political power and personal safety. The aftermath, the weight of guilt. The compromise was agonizing, but Seneca reasoned that preserving his influence, however stained, was necessary to prevent Nero from descending into total, unrestrained tyranny. For a brief time, this calculation seemed to hold. The 5 good years ended, but Nero had not yet become the monster of historical infamy. Yet Seneca was now irrevocably implicated in the imperial crimes. The murder of Agrippina established a new, terrifying precedent for Nero. Nothing was sacred, and no one was safe. The emperor had tasted the ultimate freedom of murder, and he would not stop. Seneca, the philosopher who taught the governance of passions, was now serving a tyrant completely governed by them. His platform, once a means of clemency, now served to justify atrocity. The weight of this guilt and moral compromise began to manifest in his philosophical writings, which became darker, more urgent, and deeply focused on self-examination and the preparation for death. He began to write his moral letters to Lucilius, his final and most enduring work, a series of urgent, intimate meditations on the necessity of withdrawal and the continuous practice of dying, a clear reflection of his precarious position. He was an incredibly wealthy, powerful man, but he was keenly aware that his life was now on borrowed time. The power of the philosopher was dissolving, and the monster he had tried to guide was emerging fully formed. Seneca knew that the only way to survive the coming darkness was to detach from the world he had worked so desperately to rejoin. His final act would be a slow, quiet withdrawal from the very power he had sought to wield. The horrifying episode of Agrippina's murder in 59 CE marked the definitive end of the good years and plunged Seneca into a period of profound internal and external crisis. The moral compromise was made, but the anticipated reward, a stable, rationalized influence over Nero, proved fleeting. The emperor had tasted absolute, unconstrained freedom, and the philosophical restraints imposed by his tutor became increasingly despised. Seneca's life now became a dedicated exercise in slow, strategic retreat, attempting to detach from the immense power and wealth that had become a fatal political liability. The dissolution of the partnership, the delicate balance that had defined the Quinquennium Neronis, relied entirely on the stable, dual leadership provided by the philosopher Seneca and the soldier Sextus Afranius Burrus, the Praetorian prefect. They were the two pillars supporting the fragile reign. The first disaster struck in 62 CE with the unexpected death of Burrus. While the cause was officially recorded as illness, rumors of poisoning were rampant in the poisoned atmosphere of the court. With the loss of Burrus, the pragmatic military counterweight to Nero's instability, Seneca was left alone, isolated, and increasingly vulnerable to the rising tide of corruption. Nero immediately replaced Burrus with two new prefects, one of whom was Ophonius Tigellinus, a man of infamous brutality and sycophancy who possessed no ethical compass whatsoever. Tigellinus quickly replaced Seneca's measured counsel with vicious flattery and encouragement of Nero's worst impulses. To 2. The rising tide of atrocity. The philosophical firewall had crumbled. The murder of Agrippina was quickly followed by the murder of Nero's wife, Octavia, executed on trumped-up charges to allow Nero to marry his mistress, Poppaea Sabina. The executions of senators and rivals became increasingly common, driven by the paranoia of the emperor and the cynical advice of Tigellinus. Seneca watched, powerless, as the monster he had tried to mold emerged fully formed. He understood that his position as the richest, most famous, and most morally conspicuous man in Rome made him the next inevitable target. His immense wealth, once rationalized as a preferred indifferent that allowed him to practice generosity, now stood as a glittering indictment of his Stoic principles, and worse, a tempting prize for the rapacious emperor. Third, the attempt at retirement. Recognizing the immense danger of his public profile, Seneca made his move towards self-preservation. In 62 CE, immediately after the death of Burrus, Seneca approached Nero with a dramatic, humble request: retirement. Seneca offered to surrender his entire colossal fortune back to the emperor, arguing that his advanced age and declining health required him to retreat into philosophical solitude. He hoped that by relinquishing his wealth, the greatest visible cause of envy, he could remove the target from his back and save his life. Nero, ever the actor, publicly refused the offer with grand theatricality. He gave Seneca a flowery speech about the value of his service and insisted that the gifts of the state should remain his. However, the refusal was a clear political maneuver. Nero preferred to keep Seneca alive, but financially independent, so that he could be conveniently executed later under the pretense of treason, allowing Nero to confiscate the fortune anyway. Seneca's life was officially spared, but the implicit, silent threat remained. Seneca understood the refusal perfectly. He could not retire officially, but he could retire practically. 4. The inner citadel in the moral letters. Failing to secure formal retirement, Seneca began a profound internal withdrawal. His physical absence from the court became habitual, marked by constant philosophical study and introspection. This period saw the creation of his most enduring and accessible body of work, the Epistolae Moralis ad Lucilium, Moral Letters to Lucilius. These are a collection of 124 short, urgent essays written in the form of personal letters to his young friend, Lucilius Jr., who was a procurator in Sicily. These letters are not academic philosophy. They are spiritual exercises, daily guidance on how to live the Stoic life in an age of terror and moral confusion. The intimate, urgent tone reflects the immediate crisis Seneca felt. The sovereignty of time. The letters relentlessly stress the philosophical value of time. Seneca argues that we waste our most valuable asset, time, through distraction, fear, and superficial activity. The first lesson of wisdom is to reclaim your time from others and from frivolous pursuits, dedicating it entirely to the improvement of the self. The necessity of self-examination. Seneca demanded the Stoic practice of daily self-review. Each night, before sleeping, the wise man must review the actions, words, and thoughts of the day, acknowledging errors and planning for better conduct. This practice was the foundation of his inner citadel, a method of ensuring accountability when all external accountability had failed. The virtue of poverty. While immensely wealthy, Seneca continued to praise the virtue of poverty, advising Lucilius to practice voluntary poverty, setting aside regular days to eat simple meals, wear rough clothes, and live without luxury. The purpose was to inoculate the mind against the fear of genuine want, preparing the soul for the inevitable loss of fortune, the universal brotherhood. Despite the rigid Roman class structure, Seneca wrote with surprising humanity about the treatment of slaves. He argued that one should treat slaves with respect, kindness, and as fellow human beings, emphasizing that fortune can raise or lower anyone, and that the inner quality of a person is entirely independent of their external status. V. The atmosphere of suspicion. As Seneca retreated, Nero's madness accelerated, fueled by Tigellinus. The emperor began his notorious artistic career, forcing senators and nobles to attend his long, tedious musical and dramatic performances, a profound humiliation for the Roman elite. Nero was also the prime suspect in the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, a catastrophe that destroyed a vast part of the city. In the wake of the fire, Nero notoriously attempted to deflect public blame by falsely accusing the small, nascent community of Christians, initiating the first major imperial persecution and executions. Seneca, intellectually and morally, was a voice of reason in a city succumbing to paranoia and cruelty. His immense reputation, once his greatest asset, now became a political danger signal. He was observed constantly, his every word scrutinized for a hint of disloyalty. His deliberate, quiet simplicity became a kind of political performance meant to communicate total disinterest in power. He was, in fact, preparing for his final, ultimate philosophical test, a test he had been writing about since his exile in Corsica. He had taught that the wise man must always be ready to confront death. The moment to prove that his philosophy was more than eloquent, theory was approaching swiftly, triggered by the discovery of a conspiracy that would implicate him directly in the emperor's eyes. The final piece of his fate was about to fall into place, leading him to his final, perfect confrontation with his own philosophical principles. The deliberate, quiet withdrawal of Seneca from the court of the Emperor Nero was not swift enough to save him. The philosopher had tried to reduce his presence and mute his immense reputation, but in the atmosphere of terror that gripped Rome, simply being rich, famous, and morally upright was evidence enough of disloyalty. His life, spent teaching that the mind must be prepared for the worst, was now about to reach its ultimate practical application. The catastrophe arrived in the year 65 Common Era, with the discovery of the Pisonian conspiracy, the plot and the paranoia. A large, extensive plot had been organized by a group of disillusioned senators, equestrian-class citizens, and military officers aiming to assassinate Nero and replace him with Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a popular and moderate noblemen. This conspiracy represented the widespread exhaustion with Nero's increasing cruelty, his public humiliations of the Roman elite, and the financial drain caused by his lavish excesses. The plot was elaborate, scheduled to take place during public games. However, like so many conspiracies in the age of the empire, it was betrayed. The Emperor Nero, already unstable and terrified of losing his absolute control, responded with a frenzy of paranoid brutality. The discovery led to a massive, systematic purge of the Roman aristocracy. Torture was used to extract names, and the web of accusations spread uncontrollably, ensnaring dozens of prominent figures. Seneca's implication. It was virtually guaranteed that Seneca, the most visible symbol of the old guard and a mentor to many of the conspirators' friends, would be implicated. While history does not definitively prove that Seneca was an active, willing participant in the plot to murder Nero, it is certain that several members of the conspiracy, including the core figures, were his close associates, students, and philosophical admirers. The accusers, speaking under duress, confirmed that Piso, the intended new emperor, had planned to approach Seneca after the assassination to seek his counsel and secure his approval. Whether Seneca had prior knowledge of the plot was irrelevant. The simple fact that the conspirators valued his moral and political endorsement was enough to seal his fate in Nero's mind. The news was brought to Nero that Seneca, the man who had guided his youth and written his speeches, was involved in the plot to kill him. Nero reacted with cold, calculated rage. He ordered Natulus, a known conspirator, to confront Seneca and demand to know why Seneca had recently complained to him about Nero, and why Seneca had refused to see Piso when he was ill. Seneca, in his defense, stated calmly that he had merely sought to relieve Natulus of a visit due to his own health, and that there was no philosophical purpose to his words beyond general complaint. This answer was relayed back to Nero, who, ignoring the ambiguous denial, sent his officer, Gaius Granius Silvanus, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, to deliver the final, irrevocable decree, the final summons. Silvanus found Seneca at his villa outside Rome, enjoying a quiet evening meal with his wife, Paulina, and a few close friends. The atmosphere of philosophical serenity was shattered by the arrival of the imperial guard. The tribune presented the emperor's command. Seneca was ordered to die by his own hand. The message was not delivered as an execution order, but as a request for voluntary self-removal, a grim formality common in the Roman aristocracy, allowing the condemned to save their dignity and protect their family's legal status by preempting a public, brutal execution. Seneca received the command with the extraordinary tranquility he had written about for decades. His reaction was one of pure, unblemished Stoic acceptance. He did not beg, he did not protest the unfairness of the accusation. He merely asked Silvanus if he would personally report back to Nero that Seneca is prepared to die. The last philosophical acts. Seneca immediately turned to the two great concerns of his life, his friends and his philosophy, the loss of fortune, his friends and companions, witnessing the terrifying finality of the imperial decree, dissolved into tears and laments. Seneca rebuked them gently, not with anger, but with reasoned disappointment. He reminded them of the philosophical teachings of courage and perseverance they had spent years discussing. He told them that he was dying exactly as a wise man should, not in fear, but as a witness to his own principles. The legacy. He then attempted to execute his will, distributing his remaining wealth to his devoted friends. The centurion guarding him refused this request, citing the imperial decree. Seneca smiled and said that since he could not leave them his fortune, he would leave them the one gift the emperor could not confiscate, the example of his life and the principles of his philosophy. He urged them to draw strength from the memory of his precepts, not his present misfortune. The farewell to Paulina. His deepest bond was with his wife, Paulina. When she realized the finality of the sentence, Paulina declared her intention to die with him. She insisted that she would not live without her husband, whose virtues were the guiding light of her life. Seneca, touched by her devotion, but reluctant to see her sacrifice her life unnecessarily, attempted to dissuade her. When her resolve proved absolute, he did not forbid her. Instead, he acknowledged her noble spirit, stating that since she had chosen a glorious end, he would not stand in her way. "I have shown you how to live. You now show me how to die," he is reported to have said. Seneca then had a servant bring him the standard instrument of Roman philosophical suicide, a vessel of poison. The philosophical execution. The events that followed, meticulously recorded by the historian Tacitus, are the most profound and dramatic confirmation of Seneca's lifelong philosophical practice. Opening the veins. Seneca first cut the veins in his arms and legs. Paulina, mirroring his actions, also cut her veins. However, Seneca, frail from his chronic illnesses and advanced age, found that his blood was flowing slowly, deliberately refusing to carry the poison quickly enough to his heart. The slow death. As his life stubbornly ebbed, he continued to speak, dictating his final thoughts to a secretary, refusing to let the moment be consumed by pain or fear. He turned his dying moments into a final, impromptu lecture on the fleeting nature of life and the necessity of rational acceptance. The final attempt. Seeing that his death was too slow, Seneca asked his friend, the physician Statius Annius, to administer a more concentrated dose of poison, likely hemlock, which he drank. Even this failed to accelerate the death of his weakened body, the bath of liberation. Finally, Seneca asked to be placed in a warm bath. The steam and heat were intended to open his veins and hasten the flow of blood. As he entered the bath, he took a final symbolic action. He sprinkled the warm water onto his servants, declaring it a libation, a final ceremonial offering to Jupiter the Liberator. This act was the philosophical culmination of his life. He was not dying in terror. He was performing a ritual sacrifice of freedom. His death was not an execution, but a liberation, the ultimate proof that the inner soul was inviolable and that the wise man's final act could be a virtuous choice, even when under imperial decree. Meanwhile, Nero, hearing of Paulina's attempt to join her husband in death, and perhaps fearing the public reaction to such a double tragedy, sent a contingent of soldiers to forcefully bind her wounds and save her life. Paulina survived, preserving the memory of her husband's last hours, forever carrying the pallor of her near-death experience. Seneca eventually succumbed, dying with the same clarity and measured composure that had defined his greatest writings. The philosopher had faced his ultimate fear and proven that the Stoic commitment to virtue, reason, and acceptance was more than theory. It was a practical guide for the most profound of human experiences. His death marked the end of the most restrained and philosophical era of Nero's reign. The monster was now truly unleashed, and Rome descended into a bloodbath that Seneca had foreseen and desperately tried to prevent. The wisdom of Seneca, born from a life of intense contradiction, was now sealed in history by the perfect dignity of his final moments. The enduring shadow, wealth, compromise, and the verdict of history. The dramatic philosophical execution of Seneca in the year 65 Common Era was the perfect tragic culmination of his life's teachings. He died as he had preached, with reason, composure, and a profound acceptance of fate. Yet the end of his life was not the end of the controversy. Immediately upon his death, the immense contradiction inherent in his career, the gap between his teaching and his living, became the subject of intense scrutiny and historical debate. Seneca's legacy is, therefore, not a simple story of a virtuous sage, but a complex, enduring analysis of how philosophical ideals survive when placed under the immense pressure of political power, wealth, and survival. Ere the contemporary view, martyrdom and slander. In the immediate aftermath of the Pisonian conspiracy and Nero's bloody purge, Seneca was largely viewed by the aristocratic circles as a martyr, a final, dignified representative of the old Republican virtues and the Stoic commitment to liberty, crushed by tyranny. The narrative of his calm, instructional death quickly spread, serving as an inspirational example of fortitude in an age where life was cheap and sudden. However, his critics, fueled by political rivals and historical judgment, immediately attacked his legacy. The question of wealth. Seneca died possessing an estimated 300 million sesterces, a fortune that rivaled that of the emperor himself. Critics pointed to his philosophical insistence on the virtue of poverty and the dangers of attachment to material goods. They argued that his immense riches were earned through questionable imperial favors and shrewd, even aggressive financial dealings, making his philosophical counsel hypocritical. The charge of hypocrisy. This accusation of hypocrisy, the gap between sermo speech and vita life, became the most enduring challenge to his reputation. The question posed was simple. How can a man who preaches detachment from fortune possess so much of it and cling to it so tightly? Seneca was keenly aware of this critique during his lifetime. In his work, On the Happy Life, he directly addressed the attack, arguing that his critics were confusing the means with the end. He maintained that wealth itself is merely a tool, an indifferent thing. The wise man is one who uses wealth well and remains internally prepared to lose it all. His poverty was internal and voluntary, maintained by his daily practice of detachment, even when surrounded by luxury. He contended that his wealth allowed him to practice the greater virtue of generosity and provided a powerful platform for philosophical advocacy. 2. The stain of compromise. Far more damaging than the question of his wealth was the moral stain left by his political compromises, especially the justification of Agrippina's murder. Seneca was accused of abandoning his moral principles to preserve his life and power. The critics argued that his decision to write the Senate's official letter, which painted the victim as the villain, made him an accomplice to matricide. The historical defense of Seneca rests on pragmatism. His defenders argue that his compromise was a desperate, tactical choice to remain near the center of power and thereby prevent greater evil. For a brief time, his influence did temper Nero's tyranny. Had he died sooner, the critics argue, Nero would have been entirely unrestrained, and the bloodbath would have begun earlier. Seneca chose the difficult, morally ambiguous path of lesser evil over the easy path of personal martyrdom. This dichotomy, moral purity versus pragmatic effectiveness, defines the fundamental struggle of a philosopher in power. Third, the judgment of Tacitus. The historian Tacitus, writing later, provided the most vivid and nuanced account of Seneca's life and death. Tacitus was neither entirely sympathetic nor entirely hostile. He preserved the dramatic dignity of Seneca's final moments, but did not shy away from detailing the moral complexity of his long service to a tyrant. Tacitus ultimately presented Seneca as a tragic figure, a man of immense talent and genuine philosophical virtue who was simply unable to sustain his ideals within the corrupting, unavoidable demands of the imperial system. Seneca's brilliance was corrupted not by personal malice, but by the overwhelming toxic nature of absolute power. 4. The rise of the hidden Christian centuries after his death. A strange and fascinating twist altered Seneca's historical standing, the belief that he was a secret Christian. During the early Christian era, particularly the Middle Ages, several forged letters appeared, purporting to be a correspondence between Seneca and the Apostle Paul. These documents were widely accepted as genuine for centuries. This belief was fueled by the striking moral and ethical overlap between Stoicism and early Christian thought, the emphasis on inner virtue, the importance of conscience, the sense of human brotherhood, and the detachment from the fleeting pleasures of the material world. Early church fathers, like Tertullian, praised Seneca, seeing him as a rare, virtuous pagan who had, by the grace of natural law, arrived at truths remarkably similar to those of Christianity. This misattribution shielded Seneca's reputation from the criticisms of his wealth and political past, securing his position as a moral authority throughout the medieval period and beyond. Though modern scholarship has entirely debunked the correspondence, the fact that he was so easily adopted by another major philosophical tradition speaks volumes about the universality of his ethical teachings. V. The enduring literary voice. Regardless of the historical judgment on his life, the power of Seneca's literary voice never diminished. His works, especially the moral letters, survived because of their direct, urgent, and intensely practical nature. Seneca was not trying to build an academic system. He was trying to teach people how to function well under stress. His style is epigrammatic, filled with short, sharp, memorable statements that cut immediately to the core of the human condition. He wrote about procrastination, anxiety, the fear of death, and the destructive power of ambition, topics that are timeless and immediately relevant to any age, providing a clear, calm voice of reason amidst the ceaseless chaos of the world. Seneca's life stands as a continuous, written record of the struggle to apply philosophical principles to a difficult, dangerous reality. He was a wealthy man who spoke beautifully of poverty, an imperial advisor who wrote eloquently of solitude, and a victim of tyranny who died preaching freedom. His true value lies not in his flawless perfection, but in the honest, agonizing record of his lifelong attempt to achieve virtue within the inevitable corruption of the world. His teachings on the sovereignty of time and the necessity of daily self-examination remain his most practical gifts to anyone seeking to build their own inner fortress against the unpredictable onslaught of fate. The practical fortress, mastering time, fear, and desire. Having analyzed the complex life and controversial choices of Seneca, we now arrive at the enduring core of his legacy, his practical philosophy. Seneca was not concerned with abstract metaphysics. He was focused on providing an immediate, actionable guide for managing the human condition, particularly in an age defined by anxiety, distraction, and the constant threat of misfortune. His wisdom is built upon three pillars: the relentless demand for the reclamation of time, the rational conquest of fear, and the acceptance of inevitable suffering. The sovereignty of time, the most precious possession. For Seneca, the greatest tragedy of the human condition is not suffering, but wastefulness. And the greatest thing we waste is time. In his letters, he returns to this theme with a fierce, almost obsessive urgency, often warning his correspondent, Lucilius, to reclaim your time. He argues that humans are paradoxically frugal with their money, meticulously accounting for every coin, yet they are recklessly generous with their time, the only commodity that once spent can never be replenished. Life's true measure. Seneca rejects the common notion that life is short. He argues that life is only short because we make it so. We fritter away years on frivolous anxieties, aimless distractions, in the service of other people's ambitions. A life dedicated to self-improvement and wisdom is, by definition, a long life, because the wise man knows how to expand the hours through purposeful activity. The theft of distraction. The philosopher warns us against the thieves of time. These thieves are not necessarily malicious enemies, but often our own attachments, excessive social obligations, unproductive sorrow, obsessive ambition, and the constant debilitating fear of what others think. He advises that to gain freedom, one must learn to refuse these external demands and distractions, prioritizing the inner work of the mind. The past, present, and future. Seneca offers a unique perspective on the temporal dimensions of life. The future is uncertain and thus unavailable to us. The present is fleeting, vanishing the moment we name it. Only the past is secure and permanent. The wise man, therefore, learns to revisit his past not with regret, but with satisfaction, finding pleasure in the contemplation of his well-spent hours and virtuous actions. The past becomes an intellectual sanctuary, safe from the ravages of fortune. 2. Conquering the tyranny of fear. Seneca understood that much of human suffering is not caused by actual misfortune, but by the imagination of future suffering. He recognized that we are perpetually tormented by the anticipation of evil rather than the evil itself. Fear of death. The most paralyzing of all fears is the fear of death. Seneca tackles this directly, integrating it into his Stoic worldview. He states that death is the ultimate liberation, the natural end to a life on loan. To fear death is to fear the single, certain fact of existence. The wise man, he argues, treats death not as an event that happens to him, but as an integral part of his life, practicing the art of dying daily by treating each day as if it were his last. This preparation removes death's power to surprise and terrify. The practice of voluntary hardship. To conquer fear and achieve true inner robustness, Seneca prescribes the famous discipline of premeditation of evils, premeditatio malorum. This is not morbid worry. It is rational preparation. The practice involves deliberately imagining the loss of everything we value, wealth, health, and status, and accepting it in advance. This mental exercise inoculates the mind against the shock of sudden catastrophe. Furthermore, he advises voluntary hardship, choosing, on occasion, to live simply, wear plain clothes, and eat humble food. This exercise proves to the soul that true happiness is independent of luxury, making the mind indifferent to the threats of genuine want. The power of acceptance. Seneca teaches that true unhappiness arises from unreasonable expectations. We expect life to be easy, smooth, and predictable. When misfortune strikes, as it inevitably must, we are shocked and feel cheated. The Stoic, by contrast, accepts that life is fundamentally difficult, uncertain, and filled with necessary suffering. By accepting this truth, the individual removes the element of shock and retains their composure, meeting fate with a steady gaze. Third, the governance of desire and passion. The Stoic concept of apatheia, freedom from harmful passions, is central to Seneca's teaching. He sees desires and passions, especially anger, as self-inflicted wounds that destroy the mind's clarity and virtue. The madness of anger. In his work on anger, Seneca argues that anger is the most dangerous and destructive of all passions. He describes it as a temporary madness that instantly blinds reason and leads to irreversible actions. His teaching on anger is absolute. It must be completely and immediately rejected. There is no such thing as justifiable or useful anger. The mind must be kept serene, not because external events are calm, but because the mind itself must not introduce a new element of chaos. The trap of ambition. Seneca warns constantly against the trap of excessive ambition and the love of fame. He saw the Roman Senate consumed by the desperate, humiliating pursuit of imperial favor. He teaches that seeking approval from the crowd is the greatest surrender of one's freedom, as it makes one a slave to the opinions of others. True reputation, he asserts, is not built on flattery or public spectacle, but on the silent approval of one's own conscience. Inner wealth. By managing desire, the wise man realizes he has all he needs. True wealth is not measured by the size of one's estate, but by the sufficiency of one's mind. The man who is perpetually desiring more, however rich he is perpetually poor. The man who is content with what he has, however little, is truly wealthy. Seneca's philosophy, forged in the heat of illness, exile, and the terrifying court of Nero, provides a timeless, urgent manual for inner architecture. His teachings are not abstract academic exercises. They are the battle plans for constructing the inner citadel, a mind fortified by reason, prepared for loss, and focused entirely on the one thing we truly possess, the freedom to choose our response to the world. This profound commitment to self-mastery is the engine that drives his entire philosophical system, transforming the chaos of the external world into the opportunity for internal virtue. The mirror of madness, Seneca the dramatist, and the dark side of the soul. The philosophical works of Seneca, his essays on tranquility, clemency, and the moral letters, present a reasoned, optimistic vision. The human mind, armed with stoicism, can build an inner citadel impervious to chaos. Yet a large and important part of his literary legacy reveals a profound, terrifying understanding of the human condition's darkest depths. Seneca was also a prolific and influential playwright, composing a series of violent, psychologically intense tragedies. These works, often based on Greek mythology but infused with Roman political terror, stand in stark contrast to his ethical treatises. Where his philosophy teaches control, His tragedies depict absolute, ruinous passion. This body of work serves as a necessary psychological mirror to his philosophy, illustrating precisely the catastrophic forces that reason must perpetually subdue. The tragedy as philosophical warning. Seneca's plays, which include titles like Medea, Thyestes, and Oedipus, are characterized by extreme violence, relentless suffering, and protagonists who are utterly consumed by unreasoned passion. His tragedies were likely written and performed not for large public festivals, but for small, highly cultured aristocratic gatherings. Their purpose was arguably philosophical, to provide a dramatic, shocking illustration of what happens when the Stoic principles of reason and self-control are completely abandoned. The spectacle of ruin served as a terrifying inverted lesson, the reign of rage. His plays are dominated by the destructive power of anger, ira, the very passion he had written an entire treatise against. In his most famous tragedy, Medea, the protagonist is driven by betrayal to an act of unparalleled cruelty, murdering her own children to punish her estranged husband, Jason. Medea's final chilling lines celebrate her madness, showing that for the enraged soul, ruin is the ultimate victory. The folly of ambition. The tragedies relentlessly depict the catastrophic consequences of political ambition, divorced from any moral code. Characters become slaves to power, leading them to commit murder, incest, and betrayal. The plays are a direct commentary on the toxic atmosphere of the imperial court where Seneca himself served, mirroring the escalating paranoia and violence of emperors like Caligula and Nero. Second, the ultimate psychological horror. Thyestes, the play. Thyestes is arguably the peak of Seneca's dramatic achievement and a chilling exploration of the absolute destruction wrought by a mind obsessed with revenge. The play centers on the feud between two brothers, Atreus and Thyestes. Atreus, consumed by rage, enacts a horrific vengeance upon Thyestes. He murders Thyestes' children and serves them to their unsuspecting father at a grand feast. The horror in Thyestes is not merely physical, it is metaphysical. It shows a world where the natural order has been violently inverted by human will, where reason is completely absent, and where passion has achieved absolute sovereignty. The play demonstrates the core Stoic principle. A man utterly given over to his passions becomes a force of total chaos, capable of destroying not only others, but the very fabric of existence. This dramatic portrayal of utter psychological depravity serves as that ultimate backdrop to his philosophical optimism. If his essays taught how to build the inner citadel, his plays showed the monster that lives outside the gates, or indeed, the monster that could be unleashed within the soul if discipline wavered. The third, the connection to Nero. The tragedies gain a dark, compelling resonance when considered in the context of Seneca's life. He was writing plays filled with matricide, incest, and tyranny, while simultaneously serving and advising Nero, an emperor whose own life trajectory would tragically mirror the very atrocities Seneca was describing on stage. Nero, the pupil, eventually committed matricide, the murder of his mother, Agrippina, an act that features heavily in the themes of Seneca's dramas. Nero's behavior became increasingly theatrical and grandiose, mirroring the overblown rhetorical styles of the tragic heroes Seneca wrote about. The tragedies can thus be read as Seneca's psychological diagnosis of the imperial system itself, a series of veiled warnings and intellectual attempts to process the madness of the tyrant he served. Writing about the downfall of kings driven by rage may have been the only safe way for the philosopher to criticize the very emperor who held his life in his hands. The legacy in theater. Seneca's tragedies did not have a large impact on the immediate Roman stage, but their influence centuries later was profound and transformative. During the Renaissance, Seneca's plays were rediscovered and studied intensely. Their intense focus on psychological motive, their use of highly rhetorical language, and their structure, often featuring vengeful ghosts, soliloquies revealing inner torment, and the sudden bloody climax, served as the primary model for early English Renaissance drama. Playwrights like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe were heavily indebted to the style and substance of Seneca's tragedies. The themes of political corruption, royal ambition, and the deep, self-destructive nature of revenge that characterize so much of Renaissance drama trace a direct lineage back to the philosophical warnings codified by Seneca. V. The complete philosopher. The existence of these dark, shocking dramas ultimately confirms Seneca's stature as a complete philosopher. He was not a naive idealist who preached virtue from an academic remove. He was a moral realist who understood the terrifying reality of human evil. The tragedies demonstrate that Seneca knew the obstacles to virtue were not trivial. They were gargantuan psychological forces capable of destroying the world. This understanding makes his philosophical advice all the more urgent and valuable. The Stoic practice is necessary precisely because the soul is capable of Medea's rage and Atreus's cruelty. His life thus encompasses both the highest aspirations of human reason, the inner citadel, and the darkest capacities of the human soul, the tragic stage. The philosopher who commanded men to conquer their passions was also the dramatist who knew exactly how terrifyingly powerful those passions could be. The final piece of Seneca's legacy is the enduring wisdom that draws us back to his works. The realization that the battle for virtue is a continuous, high-stakes war fought entirely within the fragile confines of the human mind. The eternal conversation, Seneca's voice, across the centuries. The dignified, reasoned end of Seneca's life secured his status as a philosophical martyr, but the true longevity of his thought lies in its universal utility. Unlike the abstract, system-building philosophers of Greece, Seneca's enduring popularity stems from the fact that he was, above all else, a spiritual guide, a writer whose primary concern was the moment-to-moment improvement of the soul. His works, particularly the moral letters, did not collect dust in academic libraries. They became essential handbooks for living, resonating through history and shaping the moral landscape of the Western world. The medieval and early Christian adoption. Immediately following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when much of the classical tradition was lost, Seneca's works were among the select few that were carefully preserved by the nascent Christian world. This preservation was not accidental. It was a testament to the profound ethical harmony between his Stoicism and the moral demands of the new faith. Moral alignment. Early Christian scholars found Seneca's teachings on conscience, inner virtue, and detachment from worldly desires remarkably compatible with Christian ethics. His emphasis on the brotherhood of man, even extending kindness to slaves, seemed to foreshadow Christian morality. The fictional correspondence, The spurious yet highly influential set of letters between Seneca and the Apostle Paul that emerged in the Middle Ages cemented his reputation. This fabrication ensured his acceptance by the Church, allowing his pagan philosophy to circulate widely. For centuries, Seneca was considered a Christian before Christ, a wise pagan whose teachings were a form of divine, natural law. This adoption shielded his works from the destruction that befell other non-Christian texts, guaranteeing their transmission to the modern world. The rebirth in the Renaissance and Enlightenment. The Renaissance brought a rediscovery of classical texts, and Seneca experienced a massive surge in popularity, influencing both playwrights and thinkers. The humanist ideal, Renaissance humanists committed to classical learning and the improvement of the human condition, embraced Seneca as the exemplar of the active philosopher, a man who combined profound contemplation with civic duty. His writings on the governance of passions and the pursuit of virtue through reason provided a vital ethical grounding for the ambitious, often chaotic, new era. Influence on French thought. In France, thinkers like Michel de Montaigne treated Seneca's works as foundational. Montaigne's development of the essay as a literary form, an intimate, conversational meditation on ethical and personal life, was directly inspired by the structure and tone of Seneca's moral letters to Lucilius. The style, the personal address, and the focus on self-examination all trace back to the Roman Stoic. The voice of reason. During the Enlightenment in the 18th century, Seneca's rational approach to managing emotions and his emphasis on universal moral law resonated deeply with philosophers advocating for reason and human rights. His writings provided a classical precedent for a secular morality based on logic and nature rather than purely theological decree. Thurs, modernity, and the practical technique. In the 20th and 21st centuries, as Western society has grappled with rising anxiety, psychological distress, and the relentless pressure of hyperproductivity, Seneca has returned with renewed urgency. He is now valued less as a politician and more as a cognitive master, a source of practical psychological techniques. Cognitive alignment. Seneca's methods align remarkably well with modern cognitive behavioral practices. His emphasis on identifying and challenging irrational fears and catastrophic thoughts, what he called premeditatio malorum, is essentially an ancient form of cognitive restructuring, preparing the mind to handle negative events by simulating them in advance. The Anti-Anxiety Guide. In an age defined by the distraction economy, Seneca's fierce defense of time and his relentless critique of frivolous activity offer a powerful, immediate rebuke. His philosophy provides a clear path to managing the fear of missing out, FOMO, and the internal pressures of ambition, demanding that we measure our lives not by external acquisition, but by the quality of our attention. The entrepreneurial Stoic. Even in the modern business world, Seneca's teachings on resilience, detachment, and the governance of temperament have found a receptive audience. His framework for understanding what is within our control, our thoughts and actions, and what is outside our control, external events, and other people's opinions, provides a stable ethical foundation for navigating professional pressure and unexpected failure. A fool, the enduring human connection. The ultimate reason for Seneca's permanence is his humanity. He did not write with the aloof coldness often attributed to philosophers. His moral letters are intimate, often confessionary, and deeply empathetic. He wrote to a friend, Lucilius, detailing his own struggles with illness, disappointment, and the difficulty of practicing the very virtues he preached. His willingness to show his own flaws and efforts transforms his works from dry doctrine into a shared, difficult journey. He assures us that the path to virtue is not easy, and that even the greatest philosopher slips. But the essential thing is the daily, renewed effort, the continuous, humble work of returning to reason after a passion has briefly pulled us away. Seneca stands today as a timeless voice, confirming that the central challenge of human life is not mastering the external world, but mastering the inner self. He teaches us that freedom is not an accident of politics, but an act of will, a choice made within the inviolable confines of the inner citadel. The journey through the life of Lucius Annaeus Seneca concludes not with the silence of death, but with the unfolding echo of his most profound ideas. His story is a rare and essential document in the history of human thought, the complete record of a brilliant, flawed, and ultimately heroic attempt to live a philosophical life under the inescapable weight of absolute power. Seneca stands not merely as a relic of Roman history, but as a perpetual voice that speaks directly to the anxiety, distraction, and moral complexity of every age. The unshakable foundation, virtue, and will. The ultimate testament of Seneca is his relentless, unwavering definition of human freedom. He lived in an age where the power of the emperor could instantly confiscate property, social status, and life itself. In the face of this external tyranny, Seneca provided the ultimate counter-argument. True freedom is an internal state, the single domain of control. Seneca's entire system rests on the clarity of the dichotomy of control, the philosophical recognition that while we cannot control external events, the cruelty of a tyrant, the loss of wealth, or the onset of illness, we retain absolute sovereignty over our own mind, our judgments, and our voluntary actions. This realization is the bedrock of Stoicism, and for Seneca, it was the key to building the inner citadel, the fortress that no external force, however powerful, could breach. The supremacy of virtue. For Seneca, the ultimate good, the only thing that guarantees a happy life, is virtue, living in accordance with reason and nature. All else, wealth, health, fame, is indifferent. This was not an academic exercise. It was his lived experience. When he was stripped of his wealth and power and exiled to the barren rock of Corsica, his capacity for reason, study, and acceptance remained untouched. His mind was the one possession the Emperor Claudius could not seize. This practical demonstration is what makes his counsel so enduring. It is not the promise of a perfect life, but the guarantee of a well-lived response to any life. The call to action. Seneca demands that philosophy must be active. It is not enough to discuss virtue in the abstract. One must practice it daily. His letters are not theory. They are a spiritual workout. He asks us today to confront our procrastination, our fear of death, and our dependency on others' opinions, insisting that these internal chains are far more restrictive than any external prison. The goal is to make reason habitual, so that when catastrophe finally strikes, the correct response flows naturally, without hesitation. Second, the wisdom of imperfection, the flawed sage. The complexity of Seneca's life, his vast wealth, and his political compromises, especially the justification of matricide, does not diminish his philosophy, it sanctifies its utility. He was not a flawless ascetic preaching from a mountaintop. He was a wealthy, powerful, flawed man wrestling with principles in the very crucible of corruption. The philosophical struggle. His career is a continuous document of the agonizing difficulty of living virtuously. He did not pretend to have achieved perfect wisdom. Instead, he presented himself as a proficience, a person making progress, constantly striving toward, but never fully reaching, the Stoic ideal. This honest struggle makes his advice profoundly accessible. He speaks to us not as a master, but as a fellow traveler who knows how difficult the road is. The weight of pragmatism. His ultimate moral compromise, justifying Nero's cruelty to maintain a sliver of influence, forces us to confront the ethical limits of pragmatism. Was his action a moral failure or a desperate attempt to minimize a greater looming evil? The absence of a simple answer confirms the messy, real-world application of ethics. Seneca's life teaches that the choice is rarely between good and evil, but often between two forms of loss, requiring courage and self-accountability. The eternal sincerity. Despite his compromises, the sincerity of his commitment to his philosophy remains unchallenged. He lived his retirement humbly, prepared for the loss of his fortune, and in his final moments faced death with the precise, unflinching tranquility he had taught for 60 years. His final act was not merely the end of a life, but the consummation of a philosophy, proving that his principles were not just eloquent words, but the bedrock of his soul. Third, the timelessness of Seneca's techniques. Seneca's enduring genius lies in his focus on psychological technique. His ideas resonate across 2 millennia because they offer practical tools for managing the unchanging architecture of human thought, the reclamation of time. His fierce insistence that time is our only true possession is the ultimate antidote to the distraction and busyness of the modern world. He demands that we must stop living in fear of the future and regret of the past, and instead live entirely in the present, dedicating every reclaimed moment to self-improvement. He urges us to value the day, not for its activity, but for its purposeful attention. Voluntary hardship, premeditatio malorum. His technique of deliberately confronting the worst-case scenario is a revolutionary form of emotional inoculation. By intellectually rehearsing misfortune, he transforms fear from a paralyzing shock into a managed expectation. This removes the power of surprise, allowing reason to retain its command in times of crisis. The governance of anger, his powerful psychological diagnosis of anger as a destructive, self-inflicted madness, remains a critical tool for emotional intelligence. He does not ask us to merely control anger, but to recognize its nature as an unreasoned pathology that must be entirely excluded from the wise soul. For the final legacy, a guide for the human condition. Seneca was a man of contrasts, a wealthy voice for poverty, a powerful advisor for withdrawal, and an advocate for clemency who served a tyrant. Yet this complexity is precisely why his voice endures. He is the philosopher for the imperfect person living in the imperfect world. His ultimate contribution is the profound confirmation that all external circumstances are fleeting, but the inner life is eternal. He gave humanity a manual for internal resilience, teaching us that no political decree, no financial ruin, and no personal tragedy can dismantle the inner life we carefully and deliberately build. His philosophy lives on, not in the ruins of the Roman Forum, but in the quiet daily choices of people striving to be better. In the moment we choose reason over rage, in the hour we reclaim from distraction, and in the conscious effort to accept the uncertainty of tomorrow. The inner citadel remains open. Seneca, the master of resilience, continues to stand at its gates, not as a warden, but as an invitation, assuring us that the path to peace is always available, provided we have the courage and the discipline to look within. The final lesson of Seneca is that the longest, most important journey a person ever takes is the one from the chaos of the external world to the rational, secure fortress of the self-mastered mind.